Chapter 8: Progressivism. Consumerism is the increasing consumption or focus on consumption and purchasing. You'll want to know that definition as we read through this first section. Consumerism and leisure time. Industrialization led to long hours in the factories, but unlike farmers, factory workers and the wealthy often had days off. In the late 1800s, as leisure time became more common, so did activities, such as shopping in department stores, which encouraged consumerism via advertisements. Amusement parks, such as Coney Island in New York. Vaudeville, circuses, and other theater. World's fairs, where consumers, merchants, and innovators came together. Baseball and other spectator sports, including basketball and college football, as well as participatory sports such as tennis, golf, and cycling. New kinds of American music such as ragtime and early jazz. Corruption in the Gilded Age. Political parties used illegal means like bribes and extortion, and legal means like convincing the poor to vote a certain way by promising them jobs, to control elections. These organizations were called political machines, and their leader was the boss. The most famous political machine was New York's Democratic Tammany Hall, led by William Mager Boss Tweed, who is said to have stolen millions of dollars from the city. The Progressive Movement. President Garfield, who took office in 1881, saw that reform was needed, but he was assassinated before he could implement reforms. Some people, known as socialists, believed that government should take complete ownership of corrupt businesses. Others, known as progressives, thought the government should regulate, not control. They aimed to democratize American society, and many of their reforms were to give the people a greater say in government. The progressive movement in the 1890s aimed to fix social and economic problems, particularly in cities. Muckrakers. The progressives gained support for their cause from journalists known as muckrakers, who exposed the muck of society. Famous muckrakers included Ida Tarbell, who exposed the oil trusts in her book, The History of the Standard Oil Company, in 1904. Upton Sinclair, who wrote about the meatpacking industry in his novel The Jungle in 1906, and Jacob Riis, who displayed tenement life in his book of photographs, How the Other Half Lives, in 1889. Another muckraker, Lincoln Steffens, exposed political machines. Reformers and their projects. Many of the most active progressives in the country were middle-class women who were well educated but were expected to stop working when they got married. By the turn of the century, families tended to be smaller, and technology, like the vacuum cleaner, helped with housework, freeing up more of women's time to create change. Political reform. This was supported by President Arthur. The Pendleton Civil Service Act of 1883 created a civil service exam to evaluate job candidates on the basis of merit, putting an end to the spoils system at the federal level. Political reform continued. Wisconsin held the first primary election in 1903, prompting voters to become more involved in national politics. Oregon introduced voter initiatives to propose laws, referenda to approve laws, and recalls to remove officials before the end of their term, allowing voters more control over state politics. Adopted in 1913, the 16th Amendment allowed Congress to levy an income tax, which gave government funding to do, in the progressives' view, great things. Ratified in 1913, the 17th Amendment gave the people the right to elect their senators directly rather than through the often corrupt state legislatures. Education reform. Progressives like John Dewey advocated changes in public education to place greater emphasis on understanding rather than on rote memorization. Settlement houses offered some of the very first kindergarten classes. Compulsory education laws were designed to not only educate children, but to eliminate child labor. Anti-alcohol reform, or temperance. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League worked to prohibit alcohol, which they saw as the cause of social problems. Temperance means abstaining from drinking alcohol. Prohibition is a time period in American history when alcohol was illegal. Temperance activist Carrie Nation charged into saloons and destroyed liquor bottles with an axe. Ratified in 1919, the 18th Amendment began Prohibition, the period during which the production, sale, and transport of alcohol became illegal in the U.S. Labor reform. Since children could be paid less than adults, child labor was commonly used. Many people advocated placing limits on child labor, but congressional limits were deemed unconstitutional. In 1905, a socialist union called the Industrial Workers of the World was established, and it welcomed women, minorities, and others who could not join the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL. Labor reform continued. Following the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Company factory fire in New York, which killed nearly 150 workers, mostly young women, who were locked inside by the company owners to prevent theft, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union advocated for increased workplace safety. In 1912, Massachusetts created the first minimum wage law. The shirtwaist company comes from the word shirtwaist, meaning the common term for a lady's shirt during the early 20th century. Women's rights. Once slavery was banned, many former abolitionists turned their attention to women's suffrage. In 1869, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NAWSA, was formed, and some of its leaders included Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Anna Howard Shaw, and Carrie Chapman Catt. The 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. At last, women had the right to vote. One of the most famous female reformers of the time was Mary Harris Jones, better known as Mother Jones, who helped organize numerous labor strikes. Anti-discrimination movements. The American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League fought anti-Semitism. The Society of American Indians advocated for Native American rights, and the Mexican American Mutualistas assisted those living in the barrios, labor camps, or predominantly Spanish-speaking neighborhoods. Other groups facing discrimination included Catholics, Asians, and African Americans. Mutualistas are community-based aid groups. Within the African American community, two major schools of activism emerged. One was led by Booker T. Washington, who believed that education and financial stability were the keys to equality. That is, if African Americans persevered, equality would automatically follow. Washington struck the Atlanta Compromise with Southern white leaders, which stated that African Americans would resign to white political rule as long as they could receive education and economic equality. On the opposite side of the spectrum was W.E.B. Du Bois, who believed that legal equality for African Americans would put an end to injustice. Du Bois used the term the talented tenth to describe a class of leaders in the African American community that he believed would help create social change. In 1881, Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute, an agricultural and industrial school in Alabama, and in 1909, Du Bois helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, pronounced NAACP. It remains one of the most influential civil rights organizations in the U.S. Another significant African American figure of the time was George Washington Carver. A member of the Tuskegee faculty, Carver revolutionized Southern agriculture by developing hundreds of uses for peanuts and other crops that were alternatives to cotton.